residents of our wonderful community and our participants on Zoom. We welcome you to our vaccine Q&A forum here in the wonderful city of Seaside. Before we get started, I'll just take care of some housekeeping. I'm going to introduce Charisse, our analyst from the fire department, and she's going to go over the process for the Q&A. And we may have Maricela, who works at Natividad, also help us with that.
Alrighty. Good evening, Honorable Mayor, Dr. Melissa Nathango, and the citizens of Seaside. We thank you for joining us today in this question and answer vaccine forum. I'm just going to give a couple of rules on how to join via Zoom. If you're joining us via Zoom, how to ask questions. So members of the public on Zoom, we have Ms. Maricela for Spanish translation. To access the translation, please click on the globe on the bottom of the screen. We also have Interpreting Services Manager, Mr. Victor Sosa, here for Spanish translation within council chambers tonight.
Recording in progress.
He will be happy to provide you with a headset for the first 10 people who arrived today. As you all know, today we will be answering any questions you have about the coronavirus and the COVID-19 vaccine, and no question is too small. And we will be open and transparent with you. Members of the public that are joining us on Zoom, we ask that if you would like to ask a question, please dial *9 to raise your hand, and I will inform you when you have the floor to ask your questions. Members of the public joining us in the council chambers, please kindly come up to the mic and ask your question when the floor is open. Members of the public joining us in council chambers will be asking their questions first, and then we will move to Zoom for individuals who would like to ask their questions through there. I will now pass the mic back to Chief Gutierrez. Thank you.
Now we're going to get our program started. Our host this evening is our Honorable Mayor Oglesby. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. So, Chief Gutierrez, this is Marcela Quezada as Unique Interpreting Services. May I go ahead and just briefly explain to our participants via Zoom how to access the interpretation in Spanish?
Go ahead, Maricela.
Okay. Buenas tardes a todos y bienvenidos a este foro de preguntas y respuestas sobre las vacunas. Le damos la bienvenida. Jefe del Departamento de Bomberos, Gutiérrez, dio la bienvenida a todos y luego presentó a Charisse. Charisse entonces pasó a explicar el proceso de preguntas y respuestas. Hoy estamos reunidos aquí en este foro público con el alcalde, así también con la doctora que nos acompaña de Natividad. Ellos estarán entonces hablando sobre el tema del coronavirus. Estaremos aquí para contestar sus preguntas. Seremos muy sinceros y transparentes. Estaremos abiertos a cualquier pregunta. Ninguna pregunta que ustedes hagan es una pregunta sin importancia. Le pedimos por favor a todos aquellos que están conectados virtualmente por Zoom, que si usted tiene alguna pregunta, puede hacer la pregunta, por favor, utilizando entonces el teclado, el símbolo de asterisco y 9, para aquellos que están en las cámaras de consejo, podrán solo acercarse al micrófono y de esta manera formular su pregunta. Primero tomaremos las preguntas de los que están presentes en la Cámara del Consejo y después responderemos a las preguntas de los asistentes vía virtual. En estos momentos quisiera dejarles saber que pueden acceder a la característica de interpretación yendo a la barra de herramienta, encuentre el símbolo del globo terráqueo, haga clic ahí y elija su idioma de preferencia, sea English o Spanish. Gracias. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to welcome all of you to the Freedom Chamber and Zoom. Thank you for being here. As you know, the pandemic is a new form of adult care increasing. This form is another effort in the city of Seaside continuing effort to slow the tide of the pandemic, particularly in our city, but also in the county. We must do all we can to push back to protect ourselves. As the experts that we have here today say, the best way to do that is to get your shot, get your vaccination, and continue testing. We want to do that to protect not only you, but your loved ones. Again, I want to thank you for coming here today, and I look forward to your questions and to the answers. So I'd like to introduce Councilmember Garcia, we appreciate them for being in attendance. He's one of the members of the Vaccination Action Task Force, we call it. Male of Councilmember Garcia, myself, Chief of Police, and Chief of Fire. Chief will also have this tonight. We appreciate her and few of her fire staff in the audience. Also want to introduce, hopefully I wanted to start all over, but also I want to introduce and make note of our community vaccine action team. They have been working tirelessly in an effort to reduce the spread of the COVID-19 virus in our community for many months, close to about 15 months that they've been working as a unit inside the city. So we want to make sure we appreciate them and thank them. And I know some of them are tuning in tonight, this evening. It's been my pleasure to sit here and chat with our special guest here tonight and get to know her a little bit, and I'll introduce her. I would like to introduce Dr. Melissa North-Nagel, Chief of Family Medicine at Natividad Hospital. Dr. North-Nagel is Chief of Family Medicine and Program Director for the Family Medicine Residency at Natividad. A graduate of Brown University, she received her medical degree from UC San Francisco. She returned to Brown for her residency and served as residency faculty and program director for 14 years before joining Natividad Hospital in 2017. We're so honored and pleased to have her expertise here tonight to assist with any questions that we may have, and we look forward to the discussions. I will now turn it over to Dr. North-Nagel.
Thanks so much, Mayor Oglesby. And I'm so glad to be here tonight with everyone. I've been involved in COVID planning at Natividad since the very beginning of the pandemic, and I've cared for patients with COVID in the hospital since the surge started last summer. There have been so many new developments with COVID this summer. I want to start with a few words about the current situation, and then we can jump right into your questions. It was so exciting for all of us in June when the rates of transmission in California were falling down really low. We opened everything up and it felt like we were finally getting back to normal. And I think that a lot of people are feeling really frustrated and worried right now as we're seeing the transmission rates go back up. And we're seeing the Delta variant, both in our area and around the country. I want to start off though by letting you know that thanks to the vaccines, the news is not as bad as it sounds. The difference that we're seeing with the Delta variant compared to the other variants of COVID is that this variant is much more easily transmitted from one person to another. So it spreads very quickly through the community, and that's why we're seeing those case numbers go up right now. Previously, when we saw case numbers go up, we also saw hospitalizations go up dramatically. And we're seeing hospitals start to fill up in areas of the country that have low vaccination rates. But in places where we have higher vaccination rates, as we do in this area, we're not seeing those high rates of hospitalization yet. People who are vaccinated almost never get hospitalized for COVID. Any deaths that we're seeing from COVID now are even more tragic than the ones that happened before because these could have been prevented with the vaccine. Just about everyone that's getting hospitalized with COVID right now are people that haven't been vaccinated yet. People have lots of different reasons for waiting to get vaccinated. There's been lots of confusing and even incorrect information out there about the vaccines that has made people understandably hesitant. So I'm really happy that we're having this conversation tonight so that folks can get their questions answered. So I'd love to just go ahead and open it up for questions so we have lots of time to talk.
Are we able to, I'm a local, for 19 years special education teacher. Am I able to ask, is it okay, can I ask a question anonymously without being on camera? Because like I said, I'm a local special education teacher. And
Well, we want to, hold on a second. What we want to do is we'll bring you the mic, but we want to make sure the people out in the space hear you. So you don't have to say who you are or anything like that.
yeah, because it has, you know, created a world of haves and have-nots, and it's gotten a little bit crazy out there. And I'm trying to make an educated decision for my body and for my family. So I have some stuff that I've written down that I'd like to ask you since
Great.
you here. And the first one is if you could help me, because I'm a layman and a lot of this stuff is hard to get through. If you could help me understand now the biodistribution study done by Pfizer, which was obtained by the Japanese government. And then through the FOIA Act, we were able to get, and we can see now with that in their study during Pfizer, we know that they were not injecting the participants with the commercial vaccine, but in the study, they actually were using the lucifera protein. And so the Pfizer vaccine that we're getting now is not the same as in the study, according to the biodistribution study that was obtained through the Japanese government. And again, like you said, there's a lot of misinformation out there. I'm just doing my own research. I could be right or I could be wrong, you know? I'm just here to ask the questions. The other one is from the Japanese government, testing people after the vaccines and the Brigham Young Women Hospital study. We know that the spike protein is leaving the injection site and accumulating in organs, tissues, including bone marrow, spleen, and liver. And then there's also a site, the Oxford academic study, which showing that the antigens are showing up in plasma much days after the shots, which was not supposed to happen. There's another study that was done in December 2020, tracking SI protein, which shows that it's passing the blood-brain barrier of mice. And then could you also explain to me the difference between risk reduction, which is what Pfizer, J&J, and Moderna used to come up with the 95% efficacy, versus absolute risk reduction, which is the gold standard of how you determine, I guess, you come to conclusions in studies that actually shows the efficacy around 20%. And finally, could you speak to the fact that the Israel government and UK government are showing that it's about 50-50 among vaccinated and unvaccinated for getting the Delta, and the symptoms are about the same? And that's all the questions I have. Thank you for your time.
That could potentially take the whole session. And they're real specific and detailed, and I think to some level of science that may be beyond the scope of this discussion.
Okay.
I'll try to briefly address these one by one. The first question about the Japanese data, I haven't heard of that in any reputable scientific source. Remind me what the Brigham and Women's finding was.
At the Brigham Hospital, 13 women, they tracked them, and out of the 13, 11 had the nanolipids, I believe, if that's different from the spike proteins, in their uterus and other organs in their body.
So the nanolipids are totally different from the spike protein. What you're referring to is the lipid particles that coat the mRNA to protect it, because mRNA is very unstable.
Right.
So it's part of the vaccine mechanism.
Okay.
I also have not heard of that study, and we would expect that lipid particles would distribute through the body just like our cholesterol particles do. So these are actually a fairly natural substance that shouldn't cause any harm. But again, I haven't heard of any studies where they were biopsying uteruses to look at the lipid particles being planted there.
Yeah.
It worries me that could be misinformation, because it may be related to the rumors about infertility caused by the vaccine, which also have no scientific basis that we know of.
Yeah.
As for the Oxford antigens being found in plasma days after the shots, that would not worry me at all. The way the vaccine works is these mRNA vaccines are injected into our muscle cells. The mRNA enters the cell, and our own bodies translate that into proteins or antigens for our bodies to react to. So that when we see the actual virus antigens, if we get an infection, we have the antibodies response, we have the memory B cell response, we have the T cell response to stop that virus from entering our body and making us sick. So that would not alarm me to have antigen presence in the body after the shot. That's actually a good thing. That means we're responding to it.
But leaving.
We won't go back and forth. She's just gonna answer the question.
Okay.
Okay. And then what is, you mentioned the SI protein?
Yeah, the SI protein study, which is peer reviewed and was done in December 2020. And it talked about the spike protein is entering the blood-brain barrier of mice. There's a study peer reviewed done.
What is the SI protein?
They said, I think it was the spike protein they said.
Okay, I haven't heard the term SI protein before. But certainly the COVID virus enters the central nervous system, and proteins can pass the blood-brain barrier. I don't know of any concerning implications of that have come up in the vaccine trials. Okay. And then in terms of risk reduction, you brought up the point of absolute risk reduction and relative risk reduction, and we always try to focus on absolute risk reduction, the percent of people who would have a disease without the treatment versus, and the difference in the percentage of people who would have it with a treatment. That's the absolute risk reduction versus saying that we've reduced the overall incidence by this percentage of the total. The absolute risk reduction sounds smaller than the relative risk reduction. Drug companies like to use relative risk reduction. In terms of the vaccine studies, they were looking at the number of cases in a large group of people who were vaccinated. So they weren't looking at risk reduction sorry, I don't know if I can explain this without looking at the study numbers.
Yeah.
Maybe I can shorten my answer to not get so specific and just say what we're seeing outside of the vaccine trials is the tremendous impact of vaccination on keeping people alive and keeping them out of the hospital. And that's what I can say as a clinician. I'm not a research scientist, but I read the data and I think I have a pretty good understanding of it. I got the vaccine as soon as I could based on what I've been seeing in the hospital all year.
I know we can't ask a back and forth, so can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, go ahead.
As somebody that got it, that I do understand, and I do not take lightly the deaths that have happened, and your comment towards that, I appreciate. And I wonder, because other vaccines take anywhere from 3 to 7 years when you get into the stage 2 and 3 to look for the autoimmunity and cancer, is that a fear that you have 3 years from now, 4, 5, 6, 7, that we're going to see that pop up big time in our populations?
So that's another misconception that's been propagated about vaccines. We don't see long-term side effects like autoimmune diseases and cancers from any of the vaccines that are in use right now.
Okay.
The reason that it was safe to approve these early for emergency use is that serious vaccine reactions happen within 4 to 6 weeks, at most 2 to 3 months. So that's why they waited 2 to 3 months before doing that emergency use authorization after we had the initial data. That's a great question, though. I think that's something that is on a lot of people's minds. How do we know that these are safe? It feels like a short time, but actually a short time is appropriate in terms of vaccine responses.
Thank you very much.
Are there any questions on the Zoom link at this time?
Members of the public wishing to ask a question, please dial *9 to raise your hand. Mayor, at this time, there are no participants.
Oh, yeah,
Yes,
we have a question
absolutely.
from the audience. Yes.
Dr. Lasnico, Victor. I have two simple questions. One, do you have an idea when vaccines will be available for children under 12? And if you have kids going to school in person, what's the best way to protect them?
Thank you. That's another question that's coming a lot right now. So we have the emergency use authorization for the Pfizer vaccine for children ages 12 to 15 right now. And the trials for children ages 2 to 11 are underway. They recently made a change to the vaccine dosing in that group and expanded the number of participants in the trial to get additional safety data. So that's going to delay the results. We were hoping to get results in September. It's probably going to be mid-October. So we're expecting, if those go well, an emergency use authorization in late fall, probably, for ages 5 to 11 and ages 2 to 5. They're studying these vaccines in the most careful way possible with kids. I think it's a little bit different with kids because their risk for serious disease is much lower than for adults, particularly older adults with medical problems, which is also why it's safe for them to be back in school and really important for them to be back in school, even the age groups that can't be vaccinated. Our data show that it's safe for kids to be back at school. We really recommend using the safety procedures that all the schools are implementing, like hand washing and masking and trying to have good ventilation. Children are at very low risk for severe illness, but many of them live with adults that are at risk. So how do we protect those folks? We really encourage those adults to get vaccinated if they're unvaccinated children at home.
Chief, look, I want to ask Dr. North-Nagel, okay, we want to back up a little bit because I did think the question is out there about how quickly the vaccine came on the scene. And sometimes you get the question and it relates to how fast it came on the scene, that it wasn't properly approved and it may have some issues with it. Has someone, myself, have been following this, I guess, at least since March 13th of last year. My understanding is that it's a form of the SARS virus. So they've been studying it for that long. So it really wasn't, they didn't start last March on this vaccine. Does that make sense? Does that ring a bell?
Yes,
Okay.
that's a great point. So mRNA vaccines have been, which is this type of vaccine, have been in development for many years. They've been using the mRNA platform to try to make an effective vaccine against HIV, against Ebola. This was not a stretch to make a vaccine that would be useful against SARS-CoV-2.
Mhm.
And as I mentioned, it's been tested in hundreds of thousands of people in the pre-authorization period. And now we've seen millions and millions of people around the world receive this vaccine with very few safety events. It's not zero, it's not without complications, but when you compare it to the actual COVID infection, there's no comparison for me.
Yeah.
We've seen the devastating effects of that. And for folks who are at risk of severe disease, it makes a lot of sense to get the vaccine.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to bounce it off against, that when it came up for approval, emergency approval, we were experiencing, I guess, close to, I forget the number exactly, 20,000 deaths a day. And well above, I guess at that time, well above 500,000 deaths. And so what would be the concern with putting off, the vaccine as it was approved, the efficacy of it at that time, to put it off to continue to study it? I mean, isn't that normal for these type of issues when you find that it really works for a patient? And I think it's other diseases too, that you find medicine that if it works, the trials are not shut down, but you tell the person that's taking the sugar pill that the real medicine is working. And do you want to be on the real medicine? Could you speak to that?
Yeah, that's a great point. When we have a situation where lives are being lost and we have a good enough level of evidence of safety, we'll move towards approval and authorization in any kind of drug trial and vaccine trial. And that's when the data is handed over to the FDA for really careful review. And there's really knowledgeable, experienced people in immunology and infectious disease that are reviewing these trials and determining that the benefits outweigh the risk. And particularly in a public health crisis like this, they're going to work as fast as they can. I think there's a lot of pressure on the FDA right now to give its official approval of this vaccine, particularly for adults, because I think that's something that causes hesitancy for people. That feels like it's not officially authorized. So they want that extra kind of official stamp of approval before they get it. So I'm hoping that that happens soon.
Yeah, and my understanding is I think when it's when it gets the official approval, then it could be a little bit more requirements to take it. My last question before we go back to the audience is, I believe before the vaccine, well, no, after the vaccine, I don't know exactly the date. I didn't write it down, but I know sometime in early April when it was really working, it was only, at one point, we went from 20,000 people, a day dying to, it was around 300. I think it was like 3 weeks ago. And the majority of them did not have the vaccination. And so when we talk about whether the vaccination works or it doesn't, we were able to reduce the deaths. And that's what I want people to really grab hold to. It's one thing to be apprehensive. It's one thing to talk about theories and scientific studies throughout the world. But at one point, thousands of people were dying a day. And through the work of our medical professionals, we were able to reduce that to the low hundreds until this Delta virus started coming back. So is there any questions? Yes, please, in the audience. Thank
Yes,
you.
we have a question that came online through our webinar. The question is, recently heard that a follow-up vaccine shot after the first 2 will be required. Can you tell us more, please?
Yes, there's a lot of discussion in the news right now about the potential need for booster shots. Thank you very much for that question. The jury is still out on that. The concern that's been expressed or potential reason for needing a booster shot is that we see the antibody levels in the blood falling about 6 months after we've been given the vaccine. So those of us like healthcare workers who were vaccinated early on in the pandemic may have lower antibody levels. That's not necessarily a problem. Whenever we get an infection or get a vaccine, we make high levels of antibodies, and if they stayed high in our blood all the time, it would become so thick that it couldn't even flow. So antibody levels naturally fall with time. What stays in our body is the memory of the shape of those antibodies and how to produce them in our memory B cells. So there's a lot of fancy immunology stuff that we're all learning as we go through this together. But when the memory B cells see an infection with COVID, they recognize that antigen similar to the one that was in the vaccine and make new antibodies against it. The other component of our immune system is called the T cells, and those actually don't decline over time. So they are ready to stop the virus at any point, directly going after the viral particles as they come in. So there's really not a concern with young, healthy people having waning immunity. We do worry about older adults with multiple medical problems and people who are immunocompromised potentially needing a booster shot so that they'll have a stronger initial antibody response. They won't have to wait a day or two for those memory cells to be activated to respond to the virus. So that's what I would anticipate that we'll see in the coming weeks, probably a recommendation for the most vulnerable folks to have a booster shot, but it's not official yet. Yes.
And we have another question that came online. When will the emergency use authorization for the COVID vaccine be lifted and full authorization be implemented?
Yeah. Like I said, I don't know the answer to that question, but I think there's a lot of pressure on the FDA to fully authorize and approve the vaccines, particularly for adults. But I don't know when they're planning to do that or what their timeline is.
Members of the public on Zoom wishing to ask a question, please dial *9 to raise your hand. Mayor, there are no members of the public who have their hand raised at this time.
Okay, Chief?
I have a question, and this has come to me many times from members of our public at our vaccine clinics and many of our events and festivals. They have a question about the Johnson & Johnson, and they wonder and want to get a 2-dose vaccine, Pfizer or Mrna, because they've read the Johnson & Johnson is not as effective. So they're trying to find ways to get a different vaccine. So can you speak to that?
Yes, in my reviews of the vaccine trials, all three of the vaccines that we have available are very effective at reducing severe disease, meaning hospitalizations and death from the virus. The studies are a little bit confusing because they measure different endpoints. In the Johnson & Johnson trial, they swabbed people every week or so to see if they had the virus, even if they didn't have symptoms. In the Pfizer and Moderna studies, they only swabbed people who were symptomatic. So the Johnson & Johnson study did report findings of asymptomatic infections that were not prevented. And that's what we're seeing now, actually, with all the vaccines, that we're seeing people who have what we call breakthrough infections, where they can test positive for COVID with or without symptoms. They usually have very mild symptoms. And we're not seeing those breakthrough infections turn into severe disease and hospitalization. The vaccines were never designed to totally eradicate infection. The only infection that we've totally eradicated is smallpox, and that was a long time ago. The vaccines are really designed to prevent the complications that we have and the stress on our healthcare system and the tragic loss of life that we've seen from severe disease.
I have a follow-up question. What is the delay in getting the full authorization of the vaccine?
I don't know the FDA process well enough to comment on that.
And we have another question that just came in. Is the vaccine safe for pregnant and/or lactating women?
That's a great question. I get that a lot. I'm an obstetric provider. We don't have as much data on the vaccine in pregnant women as we do in non-pregnant people. At this point, I think we have a little under 200,000 pregnant women who've received the vaccine. We don't see any difference in reported side effects or complication rates in that group. We have good data on measuring antibodies to COVID that come up in breast milk and in cord blood. So those are ways that babies become protected by their mothers being vaccinated, either during pregnancy or after pregnancy. Which is something really important because we can't vaccinate infants, obviously, and they tend to be more vulnerable to viruses like this one. The American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology and the Society of Maternal Fetal Medicine support giving vaccines to pregnant women. I really encourage all my pregnant women in sessions like this to talk to their primary care doctor about the vaccine, because I think it's a little bit more of a complicated discussion in pregnancy.
We have another question. Can you combine different vaccines? A family member got the first dose of AstraZeneca overseas and had to get the second Pfizer dose in the US. Are you seeing this happening in your practice?
It's not something that we're seeing commonly here because there's not as much international travel as there used to be. I think otherwise we would be. I think our official stance is we recommend getting the same vaccine, but from my understanding, I don't see any reason why it would be harmful to have an AstraZeneca followed by a Pfizer. I think we know that even a single dose gives you pretty good protection, and having a single dose of two different vaccines presumably would give you even better protection. I don't know if that would be the same as getting two AstraZeneca or two Pfizer though. So we recommend trying to get the same one if it's possible.
A lot of people are going back to school. Their children are unvaccinated. What happens if their child gets sick and they're vaccinated, the parents vaccinated? Do you have recommendations for quarantining, or is that a school by school thing?
Each school has a safety plan that they are sending out, and it's changing, day by day as the CDC recommendations change. So I would have people follow the recommendations of their school. In our area, the schools are following general recommendations coming out of the Centers for Disease Control. And so they probably look similar across school districts, but I would specifically look at your school safety guidance.
I'll jump in while we're still getting questions from the Zoom, Doctor. Would you we're here promoting definitely vaccination, but so this is a softball question. Is because school is opening up, and as a parent, would it be good for you to be vaccinated? If your child may come home positive and you're not vaccinated, then that may be a concern.
Absolutely. We know that the risk of severe disease increases with each decade of age. We don't see high rates of severe disease in, young parents, but I'll tell you, I've seen people in their 20s and 30s and 40s very critically ill at Natividad. And so there's no guarantees. So my recommendation to all adults is to get the vaccine.
Let me follow up on that one. The Delta variant hasn't it moved down in the age bracket? My understanding is, at first we thought COVID, well, that's just, your grandparents. Some of your grandparents are worried about. I think this Delta virus is hitting the younger group, particularly here in this throughout the United States.
So that is a perception, but I also want to mention that, yes, early on, people thought, oh, this is a disease of grandparents. And that was a misconception. The risk of severe illness goes up gradually. It's not just elderly people. As I mentioned, most of the people that we were taking care of in the hospital during the big surge last winter were not super elderly.
Okay.
They were 40s, 50s, some 60s, and they were really sick. So we often feel like, well, I'm 40 and I exercise and, I'm pretty healthy. I just have, I take a blood pressure medicine, no big deal. But I'll tell you, we saw folks who just were a little overweight or had high blood pressure or have diabetes, and they were getting really sick. So I think we need to be careful about pushing this off to like, well, this only affects older people, the grandparents, I don't have to worry about it. So I think it's really worthwhile for adults to get themselves vaccinated. In regards to Delta and how it's affecting younger people, it's hard to tease that out from the differences in the vaccine rates by age group. We were really good at targeting the oldest folks in our community early on. So the vaccine rates are higher in the older age groups generally when we've done that well. So when we're seeing just unvaccinated folks being hospitalized now, that shifts the age group a little bit younger because there's more unvaccinated people in the younger age groups.
Okay.
We're also kind of anecdotally hearing from the pediatricians that their hospitalization rates in the children's hospitals are a little bit higher. I don't think we know yet what that means, whether that's specific to the Delta variant or just how the Delta variant is moving in the population.
Right. Okay, that makes sense because now we're out and about, and at first, just about everybody was staying home. So of course the kids were at home, and just essential workers were out. Okay. Okay. Good point.
Great question. Thanks.
Anyone else?
Another question that I get asked a lot is, well, I had the COVID infection last year. Why do I need to be vaccinated? We do recommend vaccination for people that have had the infection because we do see reinfection afterwards. There is definitely some natural immunity that people get, and we don't want to dismiss that, but we think it's not as good as getting the full vaccination in terms of preventing reinfection or severe illness in the future. So we do recommend it.
While we wait for questions from the audience, I forget the football player's name, but famous football player, quarterback, and he's resisted to the vaccination, but he has been positive twice. And I want to get to a question is it good to just continue to be, catching COVID every so often because you think you're just going to push through it? I mean, do you think it would take a toll?
Yeah, based on what I've seen, I wouldn't recommend it. Many people do get mild infections or get infected without symptoms, and they're testing football players a lot, right, to keep them safe. In general, just because we've seen so many kind of strange complications after COVID and these kind of longer term symptoms, I'd be really hesitant to endorse that as a good plan for protecting yourself. Yeah.
Members of the public wishing to ask any questions, please dial *9, or you may type your question in the Q&A chat box.
Okay,
There is one question in the
we
chat.
have, we'll do an audience question. If you could just be succinct. No.
So you were saying not a good idea is to continually just get it, right? Which is not good for the body, but what's the, I mean, so is now the COVID vaccine just part of the rest of our lives with, double shots plus boosters? Because if it's not okay to be unvaccinated and get it and then re-get it, which would take a toll on the system, are you saying you're comfortable with getting 2 shots a year plus a booster, 2 shots a year plus a booster just for the remainder of our lives?
Right, I understand your question, yeah, that
Yeah.
you'd be worried about causing this kind of inflammation and an immune response over and over again. So first off, I don't think that we're gonna need necessarily annual vaccines and boosters. We need an annual vaccine for the flu virus,
Mhm.
which is a totally different animal than the COVID virus. The flu virus mutates incredibly rapidly, but our immunity to the virus that we got vaccinated against lasts for many, many years. There's this really neat study of people who lived through the 1918 Spanish flu.
Right.
And 100 years later, they still could make antibodies to that strain of flu. So I don't think that we're gonna need many, many, many boosters and new vaccines annually for COVID. I don't know that for sure, though. But the difference that we see with a targeted vaccine that's just exposing us to the spike protein versus having this virus running through all of our cells, crossing the blood-brain barrier, and causing a massive inflammatory response about 10 days into the infection that can put us all into full organ failure, that's a really different experience than an mRNA vaccine that's coding just for these spike proteins and having an antibody response to that in a dose that's very controlled and isn't going to make us sick like that. You know what I mean?
Yes. Thank you.
Great question.
Yeah, that was an excellent, go ahead, get the mic back. Excellent question, and let me just pull that thread for a follow-up as we wait for more questions. When this pandemic started, I don't know, 16 months ago, doctor, people were comparing it to the flu, and I know you heard that 1,000 times. But, I think you get a flu shot, everybody does get a flu shot, but it's in our system now. We've been dealing with it for decades. Now we have it semi out of control where I believe everyone doesn't get a flu shot, many people do. But we still have roughly between, I guess, the average 30,000 deaths a year from flu, and some years, I guess it can get up to 60,000. What I'm getting to is we're not in control of the COVID-19 pandemic virus as we're in control of the flu virus. And maybe one day we can get there where not a lot of people or whoever wants to get the vaccination for COVID-19 has it. And then those that don't may succumb to it, like some people with the flu. But what I want to establish is the importance of us trying to stop the pandemic first and not say, well, some people may die. Let's not be forced to take 2 or 3 shots a year to get an understanding of it. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I really like the way you're thinking about that.
Yeah.
We're still seeing, pretty widespread death and destruction, especially around the globe in lower vaccine access countries and in parts of our own country that have lower vaccination rates. So the vaccine is going to be the way to really get this into a more controlled situation where it's going to be a seasonal thing that we may see some bursts of it each year, but we have protection from it from effective vaccines, as we do with influenza. And influenza, again, is a virus that is not super risky to young people. We really worry about the elderly and pregnant women as the folks who are likely to die from influenza complications. So those are the real target populations that we're trying to protect. But we really encourage everyone else to get vaccinated so that there's not circulating virus in the community that could overcome those vaccines or get the unvaccinated people in those high-risk groups.
We have 2 members.
We'll take a question for the audience and we'll go to Zoom.
Thank you. Once again, Victor from Natividad. Dr. Nafnagel, it's very common that Latino or Latinx communities that don't speak English well have bear the huge brunt of the COVID vaccine because many of them, the way they consume information, and I know that the hospital and you yourself have done a lot of outreach. Do we know the percentages here in Monterey County of how high they are? And is there any mechanisms or any organizational structure to be able to mitigate not only for COVID, but even for other diseases among the Latino community?
Thank you for that question,
All right.
Victor. I think we've seen COVID sort of expose as an example the many ways that our communities of color are hit harder by health crises like this. In particular, in Salinas, I think we've done a great job, and you and your department have been a huge part of this, doing Spanish language outreach in lots of different media. And we were just looking at the vaccination rates around the county, and Salinas has the highest vaccination rate in the county, actually, which I think really speaks to the efforts to do really great outreach to the community and help people get the information that they need. Unfortunately, I think it's also somewhat a result that community was hit so hard by COVID. And I think that many people know someone who died or many people who died from COVID, and they were very motivated to get the vaccine as soon as it was available because they knew what a threat it was to their own safety and the safety of their families.
And then we had a question on Zoom.
Yes, we have 2 questions on Zoom. The first question is, can you explain why mRNA vaccines won't alter the DNA?
I can. It's somewhat complicated molecular biology, but we're all learning so much science this year. It's very exciting to me that people are interested in learning science. So I'll give it a go. I'm a family doctor, so I don't deal in molecular biology on a day-to-day basis, but DNA, which is our genetic blueprint, is held inside the nucleus of the cell, and it has the map for all of the proteins that we have to make around our body, each of our cells. When we make a new protein, the DNA gets read by the messenger RNA, which is what mRNA stands for, and it brings a signal out into the outer part of the cell where all the building blocks for the proteins are, and it puts those together and sends them off. It's a gross oversimplification, but it's the best I can do on short notice, and that hopefully is understandable. So mRNA doesn't actually change the DNA. The mRNA in these vaccines gets into the cell and then is translated into the proteins, in this case, the spike proteins, which are then released into the body for our immune system to recognize and respond to by making an antibody response, by training up our memory B cells and those T cells that are going to be the long-term protectors against severe disease.
Thank you. There's one more question. Of all of the different types of vaccines, inactivated, toxoid, viral vector, mRNA, etc., why was the mRNA chosen for COVID?
God, these are really high-level science questions. I don't know. The one reason that I do know in terms of why mRNA was successful, I'm not sure if it was chosen. I suspect that they were trying to develop any platform that they could as quickly as possible. As quickly as possible is the key part of the mRNA vaccine. When we try to grow for example, the influenza vaccine, that's made from killed virus particles. We have to culture the virus, which takes months to do, to culture enough virus, grind it up into proteins, put it into vaccines, and put it into people. mRNA can be made with machines now. So these sequencing devices can just pump out tons of mRNA, package it up in these little lipid particles, and make the make very high volumes of vaccine. So the mRNA platform was what allowed us to produce so many millions of vaccine doses so quickly once we figured out which preparation was going to be effective.
Great, thank you for that. We know that's not your specialty, but you explained it fairly well. No, you really did. And it's a testament to your abilities to understand this and from the science to the clinical and actually in the hospital. And that's what we want to get back to, actually, call it what you want, but it's stopping people from dying. And that's what we want to do. And as we proceed to wind this thing down, I did want to pull on the thread of we have the Delta variants. And I think that the one that's lurking behind, a few weeks behind, is the variant? Lambda. I knew it was an L somewhere, Lambda. And could you just speak to, it's I guess a few weeks behind, so we can see it coming and not be overwhelmed because it's just another variant because we're so far behind of vaccination that it's turning over. Could you just speak to that?
Right. I guess I'll speak in general to the variants. I think the news media has really hyped up the variants, and that's gotten a lot of people very worried about them. But a variant just is a different mutation of the virus. And we're specifically looking at changes in the spike proteins because that's what the immune response is going to recognize and be effective against. There's kind of three aspects of variants that we worry about. How fast does it transmit? That's what's different about Delta, right? It transmits faster than the other variants we've seen. Virulence, which means does it cause more severe disease than another variant? Which we haven't really seen. We're not sure quite yet about Delta. There may be some difference in disease severity, but I don't think anyone can say that for sure. And then third is whether it can escape the vaccine protection. And right now we haven't seen any variants that can escape our current vaccines. So when a mutation happens, like humans have mutations, like we have different, our offspring look different and have new things that come up that didn't come from us. So if I had a mutation that, like, I grew a hand coming out of my head, I wouldn't be able to wear a hat anymore. Not all mutations are advantageous. So mutations will happen and create new variants that actually aren't even stronger or more virulent or more transmissible than another variant. It's just a different looking spike protein. In terms of having a more virulent strain, the good news about virulent strains is they make their host sick enough that they can't spread the disease around quickly. So, for example, Ebola virus is a very highly virulent virus. The outbreaks of Ebola rise quickly and fall quickly because this virus can't survive. With the response to the spike proteins, they've found that there are about 100 different places that our T cells attach to that spike protein. So even if a variant changes 5 or 10 of those different regions, we're still going to have 95 to 90 other places for a T cell to attach and eliminate that virus particle. So we're not worried about these variants evading the vaccine anytime soon. But the longer we let it reproduce in big numbers, especially in countries that don't have access to vaccines, the more of a risk that we could have some more risky variants come up. So that's why the other piece about global vaccine equity is important, that we really want to stop the transmission of this virus for the well-being of everyone. And we feel that all humanity deserves access to safety and to be protected against the virus.
Well, particularly as long as we keep traveling to other countries and okay. So as we proceed to close, Dr. Nightingale, could you just share with us any of your remaining thoughts this evening?
Yeah, I'm so impressed with the questions that people brought up, really high level stuff that people are thinking about. If you have more questions about the vaccines or about COVID in general, I really encourage people to talk to their primary care doctor about their questions. And I just want to close with, I'm so grateful that we have such safe and effective vaccines against COVID. Like, to me, it's really a miracle that we got such a safe and effective vaccine so quickly. And it's saving millions of people from sickness and death. So I hope that you'll encourage your family and friends to get vaccinated if they haven't already. And I really feel that if we all work together, we're going to get through this.
Well, thank you. Thank you again, Dr. Northingle, for sharing your expertise with us this evening. It was a real delight to get the knowledge from you. As we close, I want to thank some special guests and partners over the last 16 months. For those of you out on Zoom, the Monterey County Board of Supervisors, I want to thank all of them for the work that they have done to continue to push back on this pandemic. They did a lot of heavy lifting to make sure we have more than enough doses in this county. And I want to make sure they hear that loud and clear. We appreciate our Board of Supervisors. Marie Carroll, the Communication Coordinator for Monterey County, always pushing out the latest information to us. And I think I get an email from her at least 3 times a week about what's going on COVID related, and we appreciate her. Hillary Fish, Director of Marketing and Community Relations at Natividad Hospital, making sure interacting with the public and sharing information with them. Victor Sosa, Interpreting Service Manager, we appreciate you being here and the work you do to make sure all communities are heard from and all communities receive equity when it comes to health care. Marilisa Quasday, the Zoom translator. Those of you that are listening through Zoom and the translator, we want to make sure we thank her. I also want to mention our next vaccination clinic will be hosted by Pastor Carter at the New Hope Baptist Church this coming Saturday, August 14th, from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. at 1304 Sonoma Avenue. They will have the Moderna second shot and the J&J single shot. If you've not had your shot, come on over there for your second shot, or particularly your J&J shot. And the city is giving out $25 gift cards are available on proof of vaccination. You have to have proof. You have to have a little red dot on your arm, right? And a Band-Aid. I guess you need Band-Aid, right? We also, more importantly, or most importantly, we're doing COVID testing in Seaside, provided again by Monterey County Department of Public Health. At the Salvation Army, located at 1491 Contra Costa Avenue, Monday through Fridays, 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. by calling 1-888-634-1123 or visiting their website. Thank you. Also, we have informational items on your way out the City Hall in the lobby. We want to thank you so much for being here through Zoom. Tell a friend, watch it with your family members. And again, thank you so much.